I have logged 11,407 contacts in 31 years of service aboard the Concilium Deepwatch Station Pale Meridian. 11,000 contacts. Rogue debris, misfiled freighters, misidentified survey probes, one memorable instance of a Quelari breeding drift that registered as a mass transit hull until we were close enough to smell it. 11,000 contacts, and in every single case, by the time I had filed my report and closed the logbook, the contact had resolved. It had a registry number. It had an origin port. It had a velocity curve that decelerated towards something, a waypoint, a station, a gravitational body with a name and a history. That is what contacts do. They resolve. I want you to understand this before I explain what happened the morning the iron meridian appeared at the edge of our scan envelope, because I need you to understand that I am not a man given to catastrophizing. I am a sensor officer. I am a cataloger. I have spent 3 decades looking at the universe through instruments that reduce everything to data columns and threshold values and range rings on a plotting board, and in 3 decades, I have never once written a report that I could not explain within the margins of the known. I am 64 years old. I have outlasted 4 station commanders, 2 hull refits, and 1 near collision with a Quelari mating aggregate. I am not easily shaken. The morning it appeared, I was shaken before the first minute was out. Let me begin at the numbers, because the numbers are where it started to go wrong. The contact appeared in scan window 7 at 3:12 station time, which is the dead hour of the watch, the hour when the station hums at its lowest register, and the secondary crew is drowsy at their stations, and I am the only one who has been awake long enough to actually read the raw output rather than waiting for the system to flag it. Window 7 covers the outer arc of our monitoring zone, the long, cold approach corridor that runs from the Geth Shoals to the inner trade lanes, a stretch of space so thoroughly catalogued and so thoroughly empty that it is the last place any responsible sensor officer expects a contact. I was cataloging background signals. It is the kind of work that requires attention but not thought, a mechanical scan of noise floor variations, updating the filter coefficients, making sure the calibration drift that had been creeping into the passive array over the past week had not introduced any false positives. It is the kind of work that fills the dead hours without filling the mind. I had been at it for perhaps 90 minutes. I had updated the coefficients on the primary array and was working through the secondary set, going column by column, adjusting values that had been drifting by fractions of a percent over the course of the past standard week, the kind of accumulated error that matters only if you let it compound. I work carefully in the dead hours. There is nothing else to do, and care is the only thing I know how to offer when the universe is not offering anything back. Then window 7 lit. Not brightly. That is the first thing that confused me. A contact at that range, we were reading it at approximately 900,000 kilometers out, which placed it squarely in the outer zone, should have lit that window like a distress flare if it was large enough to generate a genuine contact return. Instead, it came in at the very edge of the detection threshold, a faint smear of reflected signal that my instruments were not entirely certain was a solid object at all. The passive array classified it as confidence level 4, possible contact, probably debris, recommend continued monitoring. I monitored. That is what I do. It is not exciting work. It is not the kind of work they write about or train for in any particular detail at the Concilium Academy, because the Concilium Academy's assumption is that monitoring is the baseline, the floor activity, the thing you do while you wait for something more interesting to happen. I have spent 31 years understanding that monitoring is not the floor. It is the job. Everything else, the escalations, the alerts, the moments that get written into reports and read by people with more authority than I have, all of that flows from monitoring. All of it depends on someone sitting at a station at 3:12 in the dead watch and actually looking at the data instead of waiting for the system to flag it. I was looking at the data. I logged the range. 912,000 kilometers. I logged the bearing. I noted the confidence level and the signal strength, and then I ran the standard sequence. Active confirmation ping, wait for the return, cross-reference the return's shape against the debris field catalog, file the result. The active ping went out, 3 seconds for the lightspeed travel time. I noted the return. And then I looked at the velocity column. 55 kilometers per second. I looked at it for a long moment. I looked at it the way you look at something when your eyes have reported a number that your brain has decided cannot be correct. Then I ran the confirmation sequence again. Different scan mode, different frequency band, independent calculation. I waited for the second return. 55 kilometers per second. I want to explain what that number means in practical terms, because if you are reading this report and you are not a sensor officer, the number may not carry its full weight by itself. A standard freighter in the outer approach corridor moves at between 3 and 8 kilometers per second, efficient cruise speed for the fuel load, comfortable deceleration margin for the lane. A warship on urgent transit, the kind that has been given orders and a timeline and a captain who takes both seriously, might push 12, 14 kilometers per second in open space. Our own patrol vessels, the 6 Concilium enforcement cutters assigned to this sector, are rated to 20 kilometers per second at full emergency thrust, and we have never actually operated them at that rating because the fuel expenditure is considered unjustifiable except in the most extreme circumstances. The fastest object I have ever personally logged in my career was a Vorith Concilium rapid response cutter running a live intercept exercise, and it was making 23 kilometers per second. The crew was enormously proud of this. They sent a transmission to our station when they passed, something celebratory that I did not fully understand, but that conveyed the impression of significant achievement. I logged it and filed it and went back to monitoring. 55 kilometers per second, and it was not decelerating. I ran a third confirmation. The third confirmed the second. I ran the range check, 881,000 kilometers now, which meant that while I had been running my confirmations, the contact had closed 31,000 kilometers, less than a minute. The range was dropping at a pace that made my hand hesitate over the logging console, because I was suddenly aware that by the time I filed this contact report and someone senior read it and made a decision, the contact was going to be significantly closer than it was right now. I pulled the archive lookup, standard procedure, velocity, size estimate, bearing, cross-reference against known ship types. The system needs 6 parameters to return a confident match. I had 4 solid ones and 2 estimates, which is enough. I submitted the query. The archive returned, no match found. Refine search parameters or submit for manual review. I refined the parameters, widened the size window, loosened the velocity tolerance to account for sensor uncertainty. Submitted again. No match found. I sat with that for a moment. 11,000 contacts, and the archive had matched every one of them, eventually, even when the initial classification was wrong. The archive contained every registered vessel class in Concilium space, every known alien hull type that had been cataloged in the past 400 years of expansion, every debris field signature, every anomalous but explained object that had ever crossed a scan window. It was the most complete single reference in this sector. When the archive returned no match found for a contact classification, standard procedure was to broaden the search parameters and submit again. I had done this. The archive returned no match found for the second time in my career. The first time had been a calibration error, a misread beam angle that made a standard cargo hauler look like an exotic survey probe. I had caught the error within 6 minutes. I checked the calibration. I had updated it 40 minutes ago. It was correct. No match found. I opened a log entry and began to type, which is what I do when I need to think without thinking. The act of writing forces precision, and precision forces honesty. Contact designation WS7 Alpha. Classification unknown. Velocity 55.1 kilometers per second. Bearing inbound approach corridor 7. Range decreasing. Archive status no match returned. Visual mode passive array only. Active confirmation confirmed. Solid return. Shape signature pending resolution at current range. Confidence in solid object classification high. Recommended action escalate to watch commander. I escalated to the watch commander. Her name was Preth Sol, and she had been my commander for 6 years. She was practical, methodical, and not given to excitement in the small hours of the morning watch. She read my log entry on her secondary display, said nothing for 4 seconds, and then said, "Run the passive array at maximum integration time and get me a size estimate." Then she went back to what she had been doing, which was the kind of quiet administrative work that watch commanders do when nothing is happening. I ran the passive array at maximum integration time. The integration process takes 11 minutes. I watched the range ring shrink while I waited. 650,000 kilometers, 612, 590. The contact was not varying its heading. It was not broadcasting anything on any standard frequency. It was not responding to the automated identification request that goes out by default to any unregistered contact. It was simply coming at 55 kilometers per second on a bearing that had not deviated by a single degree since I first logged it. The integration completed. The system rendered a size estimate. I ran the size estimate again manually, using a different calculation method, because the automatic result was a number I needed to verify. The manual result confirmed the automatic result within a 4% margin. I called Preth Sol again. She came to my station and looked at the screen. She looked at the size estimate. She looked at the velocity reading. She looked at the archive status. Still no match found, and then she looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that I had not seen there in 6 years of shared watch duties. Not alarm exactly. Something quieter than alarm and more serious. The look a sensor officer gets when the instruments are telling her something she has no framework for. She said, "Wake the commander." Commander Vethoral was a large, slow-moving individual with the patience of a geological feature and the disposition of a man who had been disappointed by the universe often enough to expect it. He had been the station commander for 11 years. He had in that time dealt with 1 engine fire incident, 2 instrument array failures, a near collision with a misrouted freight convoy, and a political dispute with the sector administrative council that had lasted 3 years and resolved in his favor. He was not a man who was easily moved, and this was, in my experience, the most valuable quality a station commander could have. He arrived at the sensor station in his duty uniform, still fastening the collar, and he looked at my screen in the same sequence. Preth Sol had velocity, size, archive, and then he said, "What is the visual?" I told him we were still at the limit of optical resolution. At current approach velocity, we would have optical clarity in approximately 14 minutes. He said 14 minutes. I said, "Yes, sir." He stood at my shoulder and looked at the range ring. It was at 430,000 kilometers now. I ran the archive query one more time, with the size estimate included this time. The archive had more information than it needed to return a match if a match existed. No match found. Vethoral said, "Send an identification broadcast on all frequencies. Standard Concilium challenge, full power." I sent it. We waited. The contact did not acknowledge. It did not change velocity. It did not change heading. It continued closing at 55 kilometers per second. 390,000 kilometers. The watch station was quiet in the way that a room becomes quiet when everyone in it has become separately aware of the same thing and has separately decided not to say it out loud. I had 4 crew at their stations, and all 4 of them were looking at me or at the main display, because main display was showing the range ring, and the range ring was showing a number that kept getting smaller, and the number that kept getting smaller was attached to an object that had no name in our archive and was not slowing down. I sent a second identification broadcast, then a third. I tried the emergency hailing frequency used for distress contacts. I tried the open transit lane frequency. I tried 2 frequencies that were, technically, outside our standard broadcasting parameters, but which Vethoral authorized on the spot, because we were past the point of standard procedures. No response. I ran a new passive array sweep, broader spectrum, maximum sensitivity. I wanted to know what it was broadcasting, if anything. Thermal signature, drive emissions, weapon system warm signatures, communications traffic, anything. Drive emissions, present, very high power output. The kind of power output that matched the velocity reading and confirmed this was not a coasting object. Something was pushing this contact at 55 kilometers per second and had been pushing it for long enough to reach us. The drive emission had a spectral signature I did not recognize. I ran the drive type catalog. Not plasma, not ion, not the standard fusion torch or gravitational wave systems used by every registered vessel class in our archive. The emission pattern was consistent with a reaction drive of some kind. Mass was being expelled to generate thrust, but the specific chemistry of what was being expelled, the specific energy densities involved, matched nothing in the catalog. I noted this and moved on because there was too much to log and not enough time. Weapon system warm signatures. I sat with this column for a moment. Present, multiple emitters. I counted 16 distinct weapon warm signatures in the return data, which is not a number I had ever seen in a passive sweep of a single vessel. Our patrol cutters carry 4. Our sector's defense picket, the heaviest armed vessels in this region of concilium space, carry 8. 16 weapon warm signatures, all cold, not charged, not cycling, not being aimed. Simply present, simply there. The way weapons are present on a ship that has been at war long enough that its crew no longer distinguishes between armed and armed for combat because the distinction has become meaningless. I said, Commander, weapon warm signatures, 16 distinct emitters. Vethoral said nothing for a moment. Then he said, what kind of weapons? I said, I can't classify them. The emission signatures don't match any known type in the reference library. He said, show me. I showed him. The spectral plots of 16 emission signatures, none of which mapped to any weapon system our instruments had been calibrated to detect. They had the right frequency ranges, the right power densities, the right thermal profiles for weapon systems. But their specific signatures, the exact shape of the emission curve, the characteristic fingerprint that tells a sensor officer this is a plasma cannon versus this is a kinetic rail system versus this is a field effect projector, none of that matched anything. Vethoral said, is it possible the calibration is wrong? I said, I ran 3 independent confirmations on the velocity. The calibration is not wrong. He said, 16 emitters. I said, 16 that I can detect. The array is not optimized for this signature type. There could be more. 280,000 kilometers. He said, get me a size reading I can trust. I had been updating the size estimate with each new sweep, refining it as the contact came closer and the signal-to-noise ratio improved. The size estimates had been converging on a number, and the number they were converging on was one of the reasons the watch station had gone so quiet. I gave him the number. He stared at it. I said, that is a 3 standard deviation confidence bound, sir. I am confident in that figure to within 12%. He said, 12% either way. I said, yes, sir. He said, so it is between. He named the two bounds. The lower bound was already larger than anything in our archive. The upper bound was a number I had never associated with a mobile object. 210,000 kilometers. He left the sensor station and went to the command deck, which is where he needed to be, and he did not ask me to follow, and I did not follow. My station was the instruments, and the instruments were the only useful things in the room right now. I kept my eyes on them. I kept my hands on the controls. I kept my log entries coming. Contact WS7 Alpha. Range 210,000 kilometers. Velocity 55.1 kilometers per second. Heading no deviation recorded. No response to identification challenges on any frequency. Weapon warm signatures 16 plus detected. Archive match none. Visual resolution approaching threshold. I want to write honestly about what happened to me in those minutes, because I am committed to accuracy, and the subjective experience of the sensor officer is part of the operational record even when it is uncomfortable to include. What happened was this. I became aware, at some point between 200,000 and 180,000 kilometers, that I had stopped categorizing what I was tracking. I am a categorizer. It is the foundational skill of sensor work. Everything that crosses a scan window is an instance of something, a class, a type, a configuration, and the job is to identify which instance it is. You find the category and you place the contact inside it, and once it is placed, it is managed. I had no category for this. It was not the size, though the size was beyond the archive. It was not the velocity, though the velocity exceeded the rated capability of anything in our fleet. It was something about the combination, about a thing of that size moving at that speed, without deceleration, without communication, without any acknowledgement of our existence that a sensor system of my sensitivity could detect. There is a kind of efficiency to that, a completeness. It was moving the way a force of nature moves, and forces of nature do not have archive entries because they do not need them. They are simply what happens. I was aware that I was a sensor officer watching a natural disaster on instruments and writing it down. The optical system cleared at 180,000 kilometers. I looked at the screen for a long time, not the instrument readouts, the image, the actual rendered image from our optical array, enhanced and stabilized and brought up on the main display, where everyone who was not actively operating an instrument could see it. I have been trying to find language adequate to what I saw, and I keep failing, so I will simply describe it as a sensor officer would. It was a hull. It was an enormous hull. It was the kind of hull that you understand as large in the abstract, because your instruments tell you it is large and you accept the instruments, and then you look at the actual image and you understand in a different way, a way that bypasses the instruments and the abstractions and the number columns and lands somewhere older and quieter, some place in the architecture of the mind that simply registers. That is large. That is very large. That is so large that the word large is not doing the work you need it to do. It was gray. Not the gray of painted metal or deliberate coloration, but the gray of something that has been in space long enough for the original surface material to be irrelevant, scoured and scarred and baked and frozen, and impacted 10,000 times until the hull has accumulated its own history, the way a mountain accumulates its own history, layer by layer, each layer a record of something that struck it and did not stop it. The surface was not smooth. It was textured by age in a way that made our sensor returns suddenly make more sense. The reason the passive array had read it so poorly at long range was that the hull was not reflecting cleanly, because nothing about it was clean. It was the kind of surface that absorbs signal instead of returning it, not by design but by accumulation. I could see, at the optical resolution available to us at 180,000 kilometers, features on the hull surface, not design features, not windows or weapon ports or sensor arrays, though some of those were present in the general sense that a hull of this size would carry them. What I could see were the features that age makes. The striations across panels that had been stressed and relieved and stressed again over a span of time I could not calculate. The discoloration patterns of repeated entry into atmospheres. The gradient of char and re-entry heat that moves from dark at the leading edges to lighter further back. Repeated so many times the layers had merged into a permanent geography on the hull. The mismatched plating. Sections of hull that had been replaced at different times, with materials that had aged differently, so that the hull's surface was a patchwork of different aged metal, some sections bright relative to the rest, most darker, some almost black with accumulated history. This hull had been repaired many times. This hull had been damaged many times, which meant it had been in situations that could damage a hull of this size and had come out of them, and had been repaired, and had gone back in, and had come out again. That cycle had repeated enough times that the evidence of it was geological. It had no running lights. It had no beacon. It had no markings that our optical system could resolve into anything recognizable as lettering or symbology. The drive emission was visible from the stern, a hard, contained glow that should not have been capable of pushing a hull that size at 55 kilometers per second, but was 140,000 kilometers. I heard Vethoral on the command channel, and I heard the words he was using, and the tone of the voice he was using them in, and I understood that the conversation he was having with Sector Command was not going the way he had hoped. I understood this because I could hear the pauses where Sector Command's responses would have been, and the pauses were long, and when Vethoral spoke again after the pauses his voice had the careful flatness of a man who is choosing his words, because the real words would not be useful. I heard him say, "I understand that the size estimate seems incorrect. I have confirmed it 3 times with independent methods. I am not reporting a sensor anomaly. I am reporting a contact." The pause that followed that statement was the longest one yet. 100,000 kilometers. Even kilometers. I said it to myself. 100,000 kilometers and closing at 55 per second, which meant that in 30 minutes, if nothing changed, the contact would be at our position. Our station's hull was not rated for combat. I want to be precise about this because it matters for the record. Pale Meridian is a deep watch station. It is an instrument platform. It has no weapons, because weapons on a sensor station introduce electromagnetic interference that degrades the very sensors the station exists to operate. We have structural reinforcement and we have point defense capability against debris, and that is everything. We were, at this moment, looking at something whose weapon system count was at least 16, whose velocity was beyond the rated sprint capacity of any warship in our sector, and whose hull was so large that our nearest defense asset, the picket vessel Unbroken Reach, 6 hours out at emergency transit, would have been dwarfed by a ratio I did not want to calculate. I calculated it. The ratio was approximately 1 to 47. The Unbroken Reach was 1/47th the size of the contact. 87,000 kilometers. I ran the weapon-worm scan again. The count had not changed. 16 emitters all cold. The weapons were not being charged or aimed. They were simply there, the way furniture is simply in a room, present by default, not deployed for any specific occasion, just the ordinary state of existence for something that has always lived with them. I found that detail, the coldness of the weapons, the absence of any targeting behavior, more disturbing than an active weapons lock would have been. An active targeting lock I could have classified. It would have meant, this thing intends to fire at us. That is a familiar category of information. Cold weapons on an inbound contact meant something different. It meant, this thing is not targeting us because we are not worth targeting, Not because it is unaware of us, not because it is choosing diplomacy, but because we are not an event that requires a weapons response. We are a background feature. We are scenery. I thought about this for a while, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a calculation that does not resolve. 11,000 contacts, and I had never once been scenery. The job assumes bilateral significance. The sensor officer sees the contact, and at some level, even if the contact is a rock or a debris cloud, the contact is a thing that might be affected by being detected. A rock is still something you route around, but this thing was not routing around us. It had not changed heading by a single degree since first detection. Its course was plotted through our position, not at our position. We were an irrelevance it was choosing not to notice, and the not noticing was not indifference to us specifically. It was the same indifference it would have for any object in its path that was below a certain threshold of relevance. The threshold was above us, we were below it. 70,000 kilometers. I was still logging. I had not stopped logging for a single minute since first contact. The log was approaching 800 entries in less than 2 hours, which is the most I have ever generated in a single watch period, and I was aware even as I logged that the entries were becoming less analytical and more simply descriptive. I was writing down what I saw because writing it down was the only thing I had that approximated control of the situation. Contact WS7 Alpha. Range 70,000 kilometers. Visual clarity full resolution. Hull configuration no match. Drive type no match. Weapon emitters 16 detected all cold. Heading unchanged. Speed unchanged. The contact has not deviated by any measurable amount from its original bearing since first detection. It is not coming for us. It is going through us. That last sentence, I wrote it and then I sat with it, and I realized it was the truest thing I had written in the entire log. It was not coming for us. Its heading, plotted out past our station position, led into the inner system, past us, through the approach corridor into the transit lanes. The station was on its course the way a rock is on the course of a river, not a target, not an obstacle worth acknowledging, simply a thing in the path that the river would pass around or over without adjusting its character. 54,000 kilometers. I could see it clearly now. Full optical resolution, the kind of image that the system can generate when the target is close enough to fill the field of view. The hull filled the screen. I want to be careful here, because I am aware of how this will sound in a report. Hulls do not fill screens. View screens are calibrated to provide a useful field of view, and a useful field of view scales automatically to keep the target at a manageable size so you can read the surrounding space as well. Our system had auto-scaled 3 times since optical resolution cleared. The contact kept filling the screen. I manually overrode the auto-scale and fixed the zoom at a factor that let me see the entire hull at once, stern to bow. It filled the screen. I looked at the hull and I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what my instruments were telling me, and for the first time in 31 years of sensor work, I understood viscerally what the instruments meant when they returned a number too large to match anything in the archive. It was not that the archive was incomplete. It was that this thing had not been built at the same scale as the archive. The archive described a universe in which there was a practical upper limit on the size of a constructed object, not a hard limit, not a physical law, but a limit imposed by purpose. You build a thing as large as it needs to be to serve its function. Larger than that is waste. Whoever had built this hull had a different sense of what was necessary. And whoever had built it to last, not to look impressive, not to signal power through scale alone, though scale was present, overwhelming and undeniable. It had been built to continue operating regardless of what was done to it, which is a different design philosophy. The mismatched plating told me that. The accumulated re-entry striations told me that. A ship designed to be impressive is preserved, shown off, kept away from situations that would scar it. A ship designed to continue as used until it cannot be used, and then repaired and used again. And the record of that is written on the hull for anyone with instruments sensitive enough to read it. I was reading it. I did not want to. 40,000 kilometers. I became aware that the watch station had gone entirely silent in a way that was different from the earlier quiet. The earlier quiet had been the quiet of people waiting for something to resolve. This was the quiet of people who had stopped waiting because the thing had resolved, and the resolution was not a thing they had words for yet. I could hear the drive hum of the station's own systems. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear, very faintly, something from the command channel that sounded like Vethoral telling Sector Command the range, and Sector Command not responding immediately. 31,000 kilometers. Preth Sol came to stand beside my station. She did not ask any questions. She looked at the main display and she stood there and she was quiet. I kept logging. At 30,000 kilometers, I ran a full passive sweep. The most comprehensive scan package I had available, everything the array could produce in a single integrated observation, because I understood that we were approaching the closest point of the contact's transit, and after this point the range would increase again, and I would be working with data that was less complete than what I had right now. At 30,000 kilometers, our passive array picked up something it had not been sensitive enough to detect at longer range. The hull's surface temperature. Not drive heat, not weapon emitter heat, but the hull itself, the scarred, ancient, accumulated history surface of the hull. It was marginally warmer than it should have been for a vessel that had been transiting cold space. Not warm in any alarming way, just warmer than the background, warmer than an inert object, in the specific way that something is warmer when it is being used rather than stored. I noted this in the log. I noted it because it was the first data point I had obtained that told me something about what the hull had been doing before it appeared in my scan window. It had been somewhere warmer. It had, at some point before the dead cold transit of the outer corridor, been somewhere with more energy in it, closer to a star, perhaps, or in the aftermath of something violent and energetic. I noted it and moved on, because at 30,000 kilometers and 55 kilometers per second, there was not much time left for noticing things. 22,000 kilometers. The contact's heading plot crossed our station position on a line that missed us by approximately 11,000 kilometers. 11,000 kilometers in interstellar terms is very close. In atmospheric terms, it is distance enough that you would need instruments to know anything had passed. We were not in atmosphere. We were on a sensor station in deep space, and we watched, in collective silence, as something larger than anything in our archive passed 11,000 kilometers from our hull at 55 kilometers per second. I logged the passage time. 11 seconds from the moment the bow crossed our sensor perimeter to the moment the stern passed out of our near-range scan window. In those 11 seconds, every instrument I was running at maximum capacity, recording everything. The electromagnetic environment around the station changed. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but measurably. The drive wake of something that size at that velocity created a gradient in the local medium that my instruments could feel even at 11,000 kilometers of separation. It was like the pressure difference before weather. Not dangerous. Just present and then gone, and then the readings normalizing as the contact moved away. 11 seconds. I kept logging. I could not stop. It was the only thing I could do. And then, at 4 minutes after the passage, at the moment when the contact was approximately 12,000 kilometers beyond our station, still on its original heading, its velocity unchanged, its weapons still cold, the passive array recorded something it had not recorded before. A target acquisition. Not from the contact, from somewhere else. Something that had been in the approach corridor ahead of the contact. Something that our instruments had been too focused on the contact itself to separately classify. something that the contact's own sensors had apparently located and resolved and evaluated and decided merited attention. I pulled the secondary plot. There was an object in the contact's path. I cannot account for why I had not detected it earlier. My best estimate is that the contact's own size and drive signature had created sensor shadow ahead of it, an area where our instruments were partially blinded by the sheer scale of what we were tracking. The object in its path was large. Not contact large, but large. I estimated it at approximately 12 kilometers in diameter, a roughly spherical mass of rock and iron, the kind of body that turns up in system approach corridors with some regularity, the detritus of formation-era debris that has been drifting on its own momentum since before anything in this region of space had a name. In the approach corridor to the inner system, this object was an obstacle. It was not a charted obstacle. It was too small and too recently drifted into this lane to have been logged in the navigation database, but it sat squarely across the contacts heading at a range of approximately 400,000 kilometers, and at 55 kilometers per second the contact would reach it in approximately 2 hours. Not for us, for the contact. It was going there and the object was in its path. The contact did not adjust course. Let me be accurate about the sequence that followed, because accuracy is the only thing I have to offer and I will not compromise it even now, even knowing how this will read. The contact's weapon signatures changed. 16 emitters cold for the entirety of the approach began to power up, not all 16, 2 of them. 2 emitters cycling from cold to charged state, and the process took, I am reading from my own log record, approximately 9 seconds. Then they fired. I did not see them fire. There is nothing to see when a weapon fires at range. What I saw was the target's condition changing. The 12-kilometer object, the rock and iron drifting mass that had been in the approach corridor since the formation of the system, simply stopped being a coherent object. In the time it took me to process that the emitters had reached firing state, the target had been converted from a solid mass into an expanding debris field. Not vaporized entirely, fragmented. Broken into pieces that ranged from large to very small, all of them moving away from the center point at velocities consistent with an extremely energetic impact. I ran the energy budget calculation. It is one of the automatic things a sensor officer does. You observe an energy event. You calculate the energy implied by the outcome. You compare it against the available weapon system output estimate. The calculation is straightforward in principle. You know the target mass. You know its pre-event cohesion. You know the post-event velocity of the largest fragments. From these, you can work backward to the energy that produced the fragmentation. I ran the calculation and I got a number. I ran it again to confirm. 2 emitters, firing for a duration my instruments could not resolve, less than a second probably, possibly significantly less, had delivered enough energy to fragment a 12-kilometer iron rock body. Not from contact range, from 400,000 kilometers. At that range, over that distance, the beam had maintained enough coherence and enough power density to deliver that result. The weapon emitters were not the largest emitters on the hull. They were not, in my best read of the passive array data, anything like the most powerful systems present. They were 2 of 16, not the designated primary systems, not at full charge. They were what you used when something small needed to be dealt with quickly, without making a particular occasion of it. The contact passed through the debris field. The debris field, as far as our instruments could detect, did not affect the contact. Fragments that would have damaged our station's hull beyond repair apparently did not warrant a change in the contact's drive output or heading. It passed through the debris the way a fist passes through smoke. The entire sequence, emitters charging, firing, target converting to debris field, contact transiting the debris field, took 11 seconds. The same 11 seconds, I noticed, that the contact had needed to transit our own station's sensor perimeter at close range. I do not know if that correspondence is meaningful. I have included it in the log because I do not know how to decide what is meaningful about this event, and so I am including everything. The contact continued on its original heading, which was the inner system, which was the trade lanes, which was the inhabited space of the Geth spiral. It did not alter its velocity. It did not broadcast anything. It did not, in any way I could detect, acknowledge that an obstacle had existed and been removed. It simply continued, as it had continued from the moment I first logged it in Windows 7 at 55 kilometers per second. I logged the weapons returning to cold state, both emitters, cold, as if the firing had been a routine maintenance event rather than the complete obliteration of a body 12 kilometers across. I kept logging. Vethoral came back to the sensor station. He stood behind my chair and he looked at the main display, which now showed the contact at long range again, dwindling toward the inner system, the debris field expanding slowly in its wake. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. I could hear him breathing. He said, "What is in the inner system on that heading?" I had already plotted it, I told him. He said, "How long until it arrives?" I calculated, I told him. He said, "And we have no match in the archive." I said, "No match." I ran it 7 times with different parameters. The archive has no record of a hull configuration, a drive type, a weapon signature, or a vessel history that matches what I logged tonight. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The weapon discharge. Time from emitter activation to target conversion." I said 11 seconds. He said, "The target was 12 kilometers in diameter." I said, "My best estimate, yes." He said, 11 seconds. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "From 400,000 kilometers." I said, "Yes, sir." He said nothing more for a time. Then he said, "I need to file a report with Sector Command." I said, "I know." He said, "The report will need to say that we tracked an unknown contact at high velocity, that it failed to identify, that it destroyed an obstacle in its path, and that it is now inbound to the inner system." I said, "That is accurate." He said, "The report will also need to say that we were unable to identify it, that we were unable to match it against any known hull type, and that we made no attempt to intercept or challenge it." I said, "That is also accurate. We have no interception capability." He said, "No, we don't." He did not say, "And the unbroken reach does not either." He did not need to. I had run the numbers. I knew what the unbroken reach could do and what it could not, and the comparison was not a category of information I needed to dwell on. He left again. I kept logging. There is one more thing I logged that I have not yet mentioned, because I wanted to be precise about the sequence, and this comes at the end of the sequence, after Vethoral went to file his report, and after the contact had moved to a range where our instruments could no longer provide a useful image. After all of that, our passive array, which had been running at maximum sensitivity for the entire contact event, which had logged drive emissions and weapon signatures and hull temperature, and every detectable output of the contact, also logged its communications traffic. I said earlier that the contact had not broadcast anything on any standard frequency. That was accurate. It had not broadcast on any Concilium standard frequency, had not responded to our identification challenges, had not transmitted any signal that our systems were calibrated to receive as meaningful communication. What the passive array logged in the last minutes of tracking at the very limit of our instrument sensitivity was a signal, not one of ours, not in any format our system could interpret as language or data. A carrier wave signal tight beam directed not toward us, not toward Sector Command, not toward any point in our reference frame that I could associate with a receiver, directed outward, past our system entirely. I ran the bearing. The tight beam signal's direction, plotted out at light speed, intersected with nothing in our star charts for 31 light years. Then it intersected with a star. The star has a catalog number. It is not a notable star. It has not, to my knowledge, been associated with any significant event or survey finding. It is simply a star, one of the ordinary small fires in the background of the galaxy, given a number instead of a name because naming things implies they matter, and this star has given no one a reason to believe it matters. I thought about what kind of signal would be sent from a hull like that to a star like that. I thought about what the timing implied, post-discharge, post-obstacle removal, post-transit of our sensor perimeter. And I thought about what you send in a transmission when a journey is going according to plan, when the path has been cleared, when the obstacle in the corridor has been managed without incident, and the destination is still 11 hours away at 55 kilometers per second. You send proceeding, you send corridor clear, you send arriving on schedule. You send something that, in any language, translates to, nothing has stopped this. The signal was being sent to something near that star, or to something that had launched from near that star, was now en route, and needed to know that the approach corridor was ready, or to something that was watching from 31 light years away, making decisions based on whether the hull it had sent here encountered any meaningful resistance, anything that changed the calculation. Nothing had changed the calculation. I logged the bearing, I logged the timing. I logged my interpretation, which I want to be clear is only interpretation because I am a sensor officer and I do not file interpretations as facts. I filed it as signal detected, bearing coordinates, timing consistent with post-discharge status report. Speculative assessment. Contact may be reporting to a secondary origin or to additional units in transit. Assessment confidence. Low. Then I closed that entry and I sat with the implications for a while, because sitting with the implications was all that was left to me. The signal had gone outward, not inward, not to the inner system the contact was heading for, not to any point in Concilium-administered space. 31 light years outward, to a star that was not in our archive as anything other than a catalog number, a gravitational fact with a number attached. That signal was traveling at light speed, which means it would reach its destination in 31 years. Whatever was receiving it would receive it in 31 years. Unless whatever was receiving it was not at that star anymore. Unless whatever was receiving it had already left that star, was already in transit, and the star's catalog number was simply the last known address. The origin point, the launching ground, the place from which a thing like this departs when it departs. In that case, the signal was a progress report sent back along the path of travel. And whatever was ahead of the signal, in transit from that star, would arrive not in 31 years but in some shorter interval, depending on how long it had been traveling and how fast it was moving. I did not calculate the interval. I did not want to. I filed the signal data and I closed the speculation entry and I went back to monitoring. I have been a sensor officer for 31 years. I have never been afraid of the instruments. The instruments tell the truth. It is the only thing I have ever been able to say about them with complete confidence. They tell the truth even when the truth does not resolve into something manageable. Even when the truth is a velocity reading at the edge of your detection threshold, 55 kilometers per second, and no match in the archive, and 16 weapon emitters cold, because there is nothing in the path worth warming them for, and a tight beam signal going out to something 31 light years away that may already be moving toward us. The instruments tell the truth. I believed them. That was the worst part. In the end, I wrote one more line in the log. Not a sensor reading, not a range figure, not a classification entry. Just the sentence that had been forming in my mind since the moment the archive returned no match for the 7th time, since the moment I looked at the optical image and understood that large was not doing the work I needed it to do. Since the moment I understood that this thing had not come here because of us, but had come here despite us, had come here with a purpose that we were not part of, that we were simply adjacent to, the way a rock in a field is adjacent to the intentions of the person walking through the field. I wrote, whatever it is going to, it has been going there for a long time. We were not its destination. We were its route. Then I closed the log and waited for morning. Morning came. The sector command channel stayed quiet for 3 hours and then opened with a traffic advisory. Approach Corridor 7, inter-system transition lanes, designated no transit pending an unspecified navigational survey. No further information. No acknowledgement of my contact report. No identification of the contact. No explanation. Just do not enter Corridor 7. I noted it in the log. Preth Sol read the advisory over my shoulder. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, "They're not going to identify it, are they?" I said, "I don't think anyone can." She said, "Because it's not in the archive." I said, "Because it's not in the archive, and because putting it in the archive would mean confirming that it exists, and confirming that it exists means explaining why we have no record of it and no ability to address it. It is easier to issue a transit advisory." She was quiet, then she said the signal it sent. I said, "Yes." She said, "If there's more of them." I said, "I don't know." She said, "But the signal." I said, "The signal went somewhere, yes." She was quiet for a long time after that. I watched the range ring on the main display, the contact now deep in the inter-system approach, the number growing instead of shrinking, the geometry reversed from what it had been in the dead watch. It was moving away from us now. That was the correct phrase, and it was not entirely accurate, because moving away from us and no longer being a concern for us are not the same thing, and I am a precise man and I try to be precise about the difference. It was moving away from us toward other things, and it was not decelerating. I thought about the inner system on its heading. I had not told Preth Sol everything I had calculated, because some calculations are the kind that you complete and then do not speak aloud, because speaking them aloud converts them from a censor officer's internal working into a statement, and statements have weight. But I had run the numbers. I had looked at the heading plot, the velocity, the estimated time of arrival, and I had cross-referenced against the inner system's inhabited positions. The trade stations, the relay platforms, the 2 colony worlds in the inner orbital band, the administrative hub at Veth Point. The contact's heading crossed none of them directly. Its heading led past them, through the system, toward the far side transit gate. Whatever it was going to it through this system, not to this system. The inner system was also a route, not a destination. That should have been reassuring. It was not entirely, because a thing of that size moving at 55 kilometers per second through an inhabited system is not rendered harmless by the fact that it does not intend harm to that system. It is simply a thing moving through, and the things it passes are changed by the passage. The debris field expanding in the outer corridor would drift inward over time. The drive wake would persist in the local medium for longer than I cared to estimate. The navigational situation in approach Corridor 7 would be disrupted for weeks. And the signal had been sent. Whatever was at the other end of that signal was 31 light-years away by catalog number, but catalog numbers are where things were when they were cataloged, not where they are now. Things move. Things are sent from places and arrive in other places, and the catalog entry for the origin point becomes less and less relevant with every kilometer of transit. She did not say anything else. She went back to her station, and I went back to monitoring, and the watch station went back to its ordinary quiet. The hum of instruments and the slow rotation of the range rings and the deep background noise of the universe, transmitting the same information it always transmits to anyone who is paying attention. I added one last entry to the log, not analysis, not data. Just the sentence I had been avoiding for the past 2 hours. The sentence I had been working around because writing it down would make it a fact on the official record, and I was not sure I was ready to make it a fact on the official record. I wrote, "The archive has no match." The archive was built from everything we have encountered, everything we have cataloged, everything we have verified and named and placed in a category. The archive is 400 years of observation. The archive is the complete record of what we know. I wrote, "The archive has no match." I wrote, "We did not build this. We did not name it. We do not know where it is going, and we do not know how many more of them were launched from the star that star chart entry is sitting in, and we do not know what they are going to find when they get where they are going, or what they are going to do about it." I wrote, "We know only what the instruments recorded: velocity, bearing, heading undeviated, weapons cold, path cleared, signal sent. 55 kilometers per second. Not stopping,